Thanks for clicking. My name is Mark Mitchell. I'm a mortgage broker here in London, Ontario. It's time for our weekly China update, and there's a whole bunch of updates to get into. Well, news came out that the Chinese real estate market had slowed by up to 32% in October. The crisis appeared to get worse this week, almost by the day. Although the crisis has spread and is spreading far beyond Evergrande, I want to start with Evergrande today as it was the first real estate developer to cause all of this contagion, crisis, and credit defaults.
Thank you.
Then I want to go over a Bloomberg report, which showed just the extent to which developers are in trouble throughout China and how much the crisis has spread as of right now. After that, I want to go over some reports showing how the crisis could spread and is spreading to the West, meaning the United States, Canada, London, France, all the real estate markets throughout the West, which could be affected by this crisis. And then I want to go over some breaking news this week showing that the crisis isn't limited to just those real estate developers that have problems with their books. In fact, it started to spread to the healthy developers in China, and I think it's definitely worth going over those reports just because I think it really paints a good picture of how far this crisis is spreading, and with some of it definitely already starting to show signs of spread to the Western Hemisphere and Europe. The Bank of Canada just announced that it will be holding a press conference next week with the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of England. Most likely, they'll be talking about the global inflationary fears, as almost all of the central banks are starting to talk about interest rate hikes. So, if you want those updates, as we'll definitely have a video out on that, make sure you click like and subscribe to get those updates. But for now, let's get into those China updates. So last week, at the time of that update, Evergrande had narrowly made its bond payment, avoiding default for the second time in as many weeks. As of this video, there still has been no word yet where Evergrande got the money to make those bond payments. As we mentioned, the Chinese government has been pressuring the founder of Evergrande to make the payments out of his own personal fortune. And when Beijing tells you to do something, it's really not a suggestion. So it's very well possible that the founder of Evergrande is making those bond payments. Speaking of bond payments, Scenery Journey, a division of Evergrande, does have $82 million worth of bond payments due this Saturday. And they as of the timing of this video, they have not made those payments yet. So we will have to see if those payments are made or whether or not Evergrande's going to move into a default status. But all eyes are definitely on whether or not those bond payments are going to be made. Speaking of major updates, Bloomberg came out with a report this week showing out of the top 30 real estate developers in China, 20 of them had crossed at least one of China's 3 red lines. China's 3 red lines came out last year as the country sought to limit the amount of debt that real estate developers were allowed to take on. So these 3 red lines set limits based off a company's income, assets, and current debt levels, how much more money how much more debt that a company can take. So according to Bloomberg, at least 20 out of the top 30 companies have broken these rules, and that's not good.
This is not nothing. There are rules.
Evergrande, for its part, has broken at least 2 of these rules. And other companies, such as Greenland Holdings, which we've talked about in the past and we're going to talk about again very shortly, have broken all 3 red lines, all 3 of the major rules. So these companies are definitely even more trouble than Evergrande. And as a result of these 20 of 30 Chinese real estate companies breaking at least one of the 3 rules, the 3 red lines set forth by China, Bloomberg notes that the Chinese real estate companies are receiving downgrades by the credit assessors at the fastest rates ever. So now they're breaking records. Definitely not a good sign for these Chinese real estate developers going forward. And as we're going to see, definitely not a great sign for the rest of us at all. Speaking of contagion spreading, multiple reports are starting to come out about how this crisis could very well spread to other parts of the world, mainly the West. Up until the introduction of these 3 red lines and the unfolding of the Evergrande crisis, Many of Evergrande's competitors spent these years trying to complete prestige projects in New York, London, Sydney, France, etc., as they all sought to one-up each other with their construction developments. Greenland, which we mentioned earlier as being one of the companies that have broken all three of China's three red lines, has billions of dollars in projects in Brooklyn, Los Angeles, Toronto, Paris as well. So Greenland is probably going to have to sell some of its holdings, some of its major projects in the West, in New York, in Toronto, which we've gone over before on this channel. It's going to have to sell some of those holdings in order to liquefy its assets. In addition to Greenland, as we mentioned last week, Oceanwide, another major real estate developer, had its collateral seized after trying to build one of the biggest towers in San Francisco. That was one of the pieces of collateral that was seized, so we can start to see that not only will Chinese companies be selling their assets, they might not have a choice in many cases, as in Oceanwide's. And finally, as a third example, Guangzhou R&F Properties, which has major projects in the US, Canada, and London, and Australia, and required a major cash infusions this month in order to continue to operate. Has also crossed all three red lines, has $8 billion in debts coming due in the next year, and only has $2 billion on hand in cash. When asked about its finances, the company said that they're confident that they can finish their London properties, but made no comment on their US, Canadian, or Australian developments. So, all these developments, these billions of dollars in developments from Guangzhou, again, hopefully I said that properly, Greenland, Oceanwide, and I'm sure there will be many more to come, do seem to be up in the air, and when those get sold on our real estate market, billions of dollars into the West being dumped onto our real estate market will most definitely have an effect going forward. Finally, this crisis is spreading to even the good developers. China Vanke, which is China's biggest real estate developer, and has not crossed any of the major red lines. It's in a company that's in good shape. Has seen its stock plunge 17% in the past week as investors get scared that this whole real estate market is experiencing a major downturn. Another company, Country Garden, China's biggest builder, has seen its borrowing and operating costs go through the roof in the past week or so, seeing 152 basis points spread, meaning it's getting much more expensive for that company to borrow and operate and provide for its operating costs. So even the good companies in China, the ones that didn't over leverage themselves, that contagion is spreading to them. And this is why many in the media were calling it a Lehman moment and talking about contagion, as contagion does spread to even the healthy companies and can bring them down as well. Obviously, it's too early to tell if these good companies are going to be brought down with the rest of the real estate ships, or if there will be any type of bailout coming from Beijing for Evergrande and for the rest of these real estate companies. Week after week, this does seem to be getting worse. As we mentioned every week, we started with one company, just Evergrande, and China saying that it could ring circle this company and that it could contain the fallout. But every single week, we start to see more and more companies affected. We start to see more and more reports coming out from the news media and from various articles and various reporters who are investigating how is this going to affect the rest of us and how deep are these problems with these real estate developers. Very rare does a day go by where we don't see some sort of credit downgrade on one of these real estate developers, which, as the Bloomberg article did an investigation this week, these downgrades are coming at a record pace. So, we didn't have a whole lot of good news from Evergrande or from the Chinese real estate crisis this week, and we are starting to see more and more reports about how this is going to hit the West in much of the manners in which that we kind of originally figured it would, with Chinese investors or Chinese real estate developers having to sell their properties in order to shore up their liquid positions in China. With that said, we're bound to have more news out next week as there are more payments coming due. both from Evergrande and from the other real estate developers. So we will have updates as they come out. November is set to be a big month for real estate payments, so we should get even more of an idea of how much trouble all of these companies are in vis-a-vis their ability to meet their obligations. And that's really where the crux of this whole crisis comes down to, is ability to make their debt obligations. So click like and subscribe, because we'll have those updates out every week. And thank you so much for watching.